Thank you. It's actually wonderful to be back in Bergen and at the Nordic Media Festival. And Bergen, even when it rains, is still one of the most beautiful places in the world. So thank you for having me back. And thank you for being here at close to 4 o'clock on a Friday afternoon. I really appreciate it. Let's get started. I've promised I will wrap this up close to 7 o'clock, so let's not waste... I'm glad you knew that was a joke. I was afraid somebody might take that seriously. So let me tell you a little bit about the work I do so that you'll understand where my data, my insights come from. I'm an old television guy. I've spent most of my life in and around the world of television, the most powerful medium ever invented. And in the work I did in television, I was always taught that we blew it where television was concerned. We lost a great opportunity. And what I mean by that is television, if you think about it, is the only mass medium we knew ahead of time was going to be a mass medium. There was no question in the 1940s and 50s that radio listeners were going to embrace radio with pictures. So since we knew television was going to be a phenomenon before the first signal was ever broadcast, what I was taught that we should have done, but didn't do, is we should have tracked people before they had television, and then gone back to them year after year as they acquired and used it to see how it changed their lives. We could have learned simple things like, where did the time for television come from? When people were watching 3 hours a day and they were asked, where did those 3 hours come from? What are you doing less of? We didn't know. We just grabbed that time out of the air. We could have learned if the time for television came from talking to the family, from sleep, from reading books, newspapers, or magazines, or from some other place. And in the 90s, I became convinced that digital communication, first the web and now mobile, was going to be far more powerful than television. So believing that we lost a great opportunity with television in the 40s and 50s, and that digital was going to be even more important, 13 years ago, we launched this massive project, this tracking of digital that we thought should have been conducted of television in the 40s. And very briefly, we started in the United States in 2000 with a representative sample of the American population, and we've gone back to the same people 13 years in a row. We've watched as they've gone from non-user to dial-up, and then from dial-up to broadband. We saw almost immediately broadband changed everything, not because of the speed, but the always-on, the direct connection was what really made broadband so profound. We watch as 2% drop off the web each year, and we want to know who are these people who leave and why, and more importantly, do they return, and if so, when and what brings them back. And then lastly, we track the never users. Who are the people who have never gone online and why? How do they do things offline the rest of us do online? And increasingly, they pay more to do it offline. And then a question we're working with governments around the world, should we care about the never users? Should we be pushing them online, subsidizing them, or should we let them live their lives peaceably and happily disconnected from the web? We started in the US. We're now doing this work in about 36 countries around the world. We just added the Republic of Georgia. We're throughout Europe. We're throughout Asia, Latin America. But I'm sad to say we're not in Norway. If I can get your competitive juices running, we are in Sweden, and the Swedes do great work, but we'd love to be here in Norway if anybody wanted to be our partner, collecting data and sharing insights around the world. So that's what I do. Let me share some of what we found globally over the last 13 years. Incidentally, I don't use PowerPoint anymore. I don't do that to make a point. I just found I don't need it. So I'm willing to be as nimble as you would like. I'll go through the things I think you're interested in, but if people want to bring up other topics, I'm happy to move and cover other things as well. But let's start with the importance of video. In 1975, The average person spent 16 hours a week in front of a screen. Last year, it was 44 hours. The difference in 1975, it was one screen in the home on a schedule, and last year it was 3, or depending on how you count tablets, and we'll get to that in a couple of minutes, it was 4 screens. More importantly, we think those 44 hours will be 55 hours in the next 3 to 4 years. But if you forget the 55 for a moment and just look at the 44, that's already 1/4 of all human time. If you take out sleep, that's about 1/3 of all time spent in front of a screen. If you talk to a teenager, there's practically not a moment of their lives, except when they're in school and asleep, that they're not in front of a screen. And I'm not so sure they're not in front of a screen when they're in school. They certainly are during lunch and recess, and more of them than we'd like to admit probably are during class. And as far as sleep is concerned, we know that 80% of teenagers sleep next to their mobile phones. If you ask them why do they sleep next to their mobile phones, they'll give you one simple, obvious, direct answer. It's my watch or my alarm clock. We and everybody else learned 10, 12 years ago, teenagers don't wear watches. I made a comment in 2001 that I thought was a silly comment, but it's turned out not to be so silly. I said in 2001, now the entire jewelry industry, not to mention the economy of Switzerland, is waiting to the answer to the question, will they start wearing watches when they get older? Well, we've been tracking them for 13 years, and they're still not wearing watches. The people who are 30 now, who were 17. This, incidentally, has no implications for Rolex. Nobody spends 10,000 euros on a watch because it tells better time. If you just want a good timepiece, you don't have to spend more than 10 euros. Anybody who spends 10,000 euros on a watch either wants to send a message to other people or wants to feel better about themselves. Interestingly, one short digression. In New York City, if you've been or have been to any American cities in the last couple of years, but especially New York, crime has dropped at amazing levels. New York, I think, is now the safest big city in America. Murder rates have decreased by over 80%. You can walk in the park in the middle of the night. But in January of this year, Mayor Bloomberg reported that crime in New York actually ticked up a tiny bit for the first time in 20 years, and it was all attributable, he says, to iPhone theft. And one of my friends who tracks this says, not that this is a primer on how to be a criminal, but says, you want to know how people steal iPhones? They walk up to teenagers and say, do you have the time? And of course, what they do is they reach in their pocket, take it out, and say, it's like walking around with your wallet in your hands that somebody can just come up and take it. Anyway, file away. So we know that screen time is increasing dramatically. And what we're seeing is tremendous reliance on video and the role of video increasing in people's lives. Never has there been so much content to choose from. I would argue never has there been so much good content. On the other hand, never has there been so much bad content. And what we're finding 13 years into our work, that people are now beginning to understand the value of producers, writers, directors. If you were here for that phenomenal presentation on Game of Thrones, people appreciate all the work that goes into that. We're seeing, for example, that teenagers now, for the first time in America, are going to the NewYorkTimes.com because they need shorthand for quality, reliability. We think, whether it's in news or whether it's in television or whether it's in entertainment of any form, we think content has always been king. But today, with so much digital content and so much to choose with, we think content is kinger than it has ever been. Pardon the deliberately inappropriate grammar. We're seeing the ratings for live television events climb to levels we've never seen before. In the United States, last year, our Super Bowl became the highest rated television program in our history, beating the previous record, the Super Bowl of the year before, which beat a 28-year record, the last episode of MASH. We're seeing the ratings for other sporting events, for award shows, but it's not just the US. The ratings for the World Cup finals 3 years ago. And the reason we think the ratings for live events are climbing so much is co-viewing, watching television with other people. Now, we've always watched television with other people. The difference was, until digital, the other people had to be in the room with us. That's one of the reasons television had laugh tracks. Movie theaters don't have laugh tracks because they know if you're watching a comedy, unless the film is an absolute disaster, there will be other people in the audience with you making you laugh. But television producers don't know if you're watching that show from your hospital bed or your own bed alone at night, so they provide the other people to make you laugh. But now, so the other people had to be in the room with us, but now we're watching with other people when they're not with us. Other people we're watching through social networks, through texting, through interactive television, through all of these different ways of watching. I actually think the little crawl at the bottom of the screen, the secondary news source that came into fashion, particularly after 9/11, is going to be replaced very soon by a social networking crawl, so that people who are watching together can dial in or type in or enter in what they're thinking and share with their group of friends who are watching. In countries where DVR or PVR penetration is rising, I think one of the great killer apps is going to be an app that's going to let 5 of us or 10 of us record a show and then agree on a time to watch it. And as we agree to watch it, it will synchronize our DVRs so that we can watch the exact play, the exact action at the same time as if it were live and share it with each other. We're going to create the liveness even when it's delayed, but the ratings for live events we think will continue to climb. 3 statistics, and I'm not using a lot of statistics today, 3 statistics which didn't change for 10 years. From 2000 to 2010, we saw 70% of people regularly went from television to the internet. They saw something on television that drove them to the web. 60% of people regularly went from the web to television. They saw something online that drove them to television. But until 2010, only 14% of web users were ever online watching television at the same time with related content. That doesn't count watching television while you're checking your email. That meant watching Survivor or watching Big Brother while you're on the Big Brother website. That 14% has tripled in the last 2.5 years to close to 50% who are online and watching television with related content. And of course, one of the ways that is happening is devices, mobile devices you can have with you. Of course, smartphones, but especially tablets. Now, I happen to think the iPad is transformational. Invite me back in a year or two, and I might amend that to tablets are transformational. But right now, I think it's the iPad that's transformational. Samsung, Hewlett-Packard, Motorola, RIM have all had 3 years to try to catch up with Apple and the iPad, and none of them have. The only people who have caught up to Apple and the iPad are Apple themselves with the iPad 2, the device they refuse to call the iPad 3, and nobody knows what the iPad 4 officially is called. Sort of snuck into being a few months ago. I have friends at Apple who speak off the record, and at Apple you have to speak off the record. If you ever spoke on the record at Apple, you could be killed. And that's only a slight exaggeration. They say off the record that 2 years ago, as they were preparing to introduce the iPad 2, they were planning to drop the price by $150. But they looked around and they said, nobody's beating us on price. Nobody's beating us on features. Why bother? And they were right, because later that summer, Hewlett-Packard introduced their touchpad. And their touchpad came out at the same base price as the iPad, which in the US, it's slightly higher here. In the US was $499 for the 16 gig Wi-Fi version. People looked at the touchpad, priced exactly the same, and said, who cares? Realizing they had made a mistake, Hewlett-Packard, 3 weeks later, dropped the price by $100 to $399. People looked at it again and again said, who cares? Then they made this astonishing decision to shut down their entire PC division, a decision they since have rethought, but they fired their CEO over it, and they dropped the price of the touchpad to $99. Finally, people cared and went out and bought it. The problem, however, for Hewlett-Packard is it cost $309 to make a touchpad. So the lesson is clear. You're willing to lose $220 per touchpad, you've got a great business. Nobody is competing yet with the iPad. So the iPad comes out, and my job is to look at this thing and say, is this the fourth screen, or does it replace the second screen? Now, I think we all count screens the same way, but just to be sure, television is the first screen. The computer, laptop, or desktop is the second screen. The smartphone is the third screen. Movie theater owners have been complaining for 10 years now, hey, we're the fourth screen, but nobody takes that seriously, probably because you don't own that screen or rent that screen. It's somebody else's screen. So is the iPad or the tablet the fourth screen, or does it replace the second? We firmly believe it replaces the second. We think, and we've thought for about 5 years now, that the PC is going away, except for 4 to 6% of the population. The people we think who will continue to use PCs, computer-assisted designers, heavy-duty number crunchers, big writers, college students while they're in college. But for the rest of the population, we think the PC is a needlessly complex device that's difficult to learn, takes 5 minutes to boot, and 1 out of every 20 times encounters the blue screen of death. Whereas a tablet, easy to learn, you hand a tablet to a 3-year-old boy or an 83-year-old grandmother, and within 5 minutes, both will be using it. The only difference is within 5 minutes, the 3-year-old boy will be teaching you things you didn't know. It boots instantly. If you log off of a tablet forgetting to do something, you don't have to negotiate with yourself, is this important enough to reboot and wait, which we do all, because there is no reboot time, and there's no blue screen of death. I don't know anyone who travels for business who uses a tablet and a laptop, who when they're about to go on a trip doesn't look at their laptop and then look at their tablet and then look back at their laptop and say, can I leave you at home? What they're really saying is, I want to leave you at home, but what do I have to do, and do I have to take the big laptop? And increasingly they don't. Keep in mind the biggest limitations on the tablet or the iPad come not from the device or the technology, they came from the stubbornness of Steve Jobs. The refusal to have Adobe Flash. There's no reason an iPad can't have Adobe Flash. That was just Jobs declaring war on Adobe, a war he won just before he passed away. The refusal to have an SD card support or a USB support, that was Jobs wanting a totally walled garden that he controlled. You could easily put a USB port on an iPad. Jobs just didn't want to. But now Jobs is gone. Walter Isaacson, his biographer, said that Jobs' influence will be on everything that comes out of Apple for 24 months after his death. It's now month 19, so if there's one great innovation Jobs had left, we should see it in the next 5 months or so. And we know already Apple is moving in a different direction based on competition from the Nexus 7 and from the Amazon Kindle Fire, which are $200, and against Jobs' will, although he wasn't there to stop it. We did see a mini iPad, something he used to make fun of. So we think tablets really are transformational. Another trend, something we never predicted when we started. When we started, it was obvious to us in 2000 that how we work, how we communicate, how we buy, that all of those things were going to change. But we never anticipated social networking. And social networking, we think, is the real deal. The first thing we have seen that has caused people to log on to the web more than to check their email. Now, I have an unusual take on social networking, which I'll share. We think that which social network a teenager is in is a fad or a trend. 8 years ago, Rupert Murdoch bought MySpace for $580 million. And he bought it because he said it would allow him to reach the teenagers he could no longer reach through his newspapers and who were even getting harder to reach through his television networks. At about the same time that Murdoch bought MySpace, 2005, we released our 5th annual report. I mentioned we started in 2000. And when we were releasing our 5th report, there were a bunch of reporters asking questions. What are you finding? What's new? And then the last question, sort of an afterthought question, was, what do you think about Murdoch buying MySpace? And I said, I thought it was a great investment. That part of the quote has been lost forever. But that he would never be able to hang on to the teenage users of MySpace. And News Corp and Murdoch got angry when I said that, and they fought back by saying, not you're wrong, but they fought back by saying, look how much money we're making. And they were absolutely right. MySpace was a great investment. Even though we paid $580 million in 2005, and sold it 2 years ago for $35 million to a group of investors, including Justin Timberlake, it was not a bad investment. Almost the day he bought MySpace, MySpace signed a $900 million ad share deal with Google, practically doubling their investment. They brilliantly marketed their Fox films and television shows on MySpace, and they sold a lot of advertising. MySpace was a great investment. The only disappointment was they couldn't sustain it. And it was particularly a good investment if you compare it to something like AOL 4 years ago buying Bebo for $850 million and selling it less than 2 years later for $5 million. So MySpace was a great investment, but we were right. They weren't able to hang on to the teenage users of MySpace. It's not that we were so smart or prescient. We had seen the rise and fall of other social networks, GeoCities in the early part of the century, and social networks some of you may have used, Friendster, and we knew, and we got a lot of coverage when we said this, a lot of people liked this quote, but we didn't say it to get quoted. We knew that to a teenager, a social network is like a nightclub. And when the nightclub becomes too popular, or the uncool kids start showing up at the network, you're out of there. And as a teenager, what's the worst thing that could happen to you in a nightclub? Not literally the worst. Literally the worst would be somebody with a bomb or a gun coming in. But to most teenagers, what's the worst thing that could happen to you in a nightclub? Your mother walks in. Well, now your mother wants to friend you on Facebook. How long are you going to hang around in a place with your cool friends where your mother's hanging around? So 2 years ago, we released our 10th report. Some of the same reporters were there, and they said, okay, you got it right on MySpace. What's going to happen to Facebook? And I can stand here and tell you we were right on MySpace. I can't tell you that I'm right on Facebook. I can just tell you what I think, and we'll all have to come back in a couple of years to see. But I said 2 years ago, I think the same thing happens to Facebook, with two exceptions. One, I think Facebook will grow for another 4 or 5 years. It's already at 1 billion users. I think it'll grow to 1.5 billion, particularly in the developing world. 3 years ago in Brazil, Google's social networking site, Orkut, O-R-K-U-T, was practically a way of life or a religion. Now it's almost gone. Same thing in India. So we think MySpace will grow to 1.5 billion, but the fact they're at 1 billion is phenomenal. That's 1 billion people today out of 7 billion people on the planet. But it's actually much more impressive than that, because 1.3 billion people on the planet can't get Facebook. The Chinese, because it's not allowed and they have their own substitutes. So Facebook is actually 1 billion people out of 5.7 billion people who can get it. So we think it'll grow for another 4 or 5 years. And second, I don't think Facebook ever goes away or disappears. I think it survives forever. They hate it when I say this, but I don't think this is such a terrible thing. I think it survives forever as the place you go to communicate with your mother and father and brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles. It becomes the phone directory of the planet. It becomes the place you find people and initiate contact. But we think if you want to have a relationship with somebody, you'll move them to a smaller network. And I don't think that's going to be Google+, which is already at 400 million. We think there are going to be lots of smaller networks, not a single one that replaces Facebook. Now, I get to spend a lot of time with governments and with brands and with media companies who are trying to figure this whole social networking thing out. And one of the things that strikes me is everybody's confused by social networking. Nobody feels comfortable about it. Everybody thinks they're behind. Even companies that I would argue are ahead of everybody else, Nike, American Express, Coca-Cola, think they're behind. Nobody's comfortable. About 3 years ago, I was a speaker at the Google Zeitgeist, the American Google Zeitgeist in Mountain View, and I was having a conversation on stage with the chief marketing officer of one of the biggest consumer packaged good companies on the planet, a company that spends billions of dollars on advertising. And I was asking this guy, the CMO, who's a friend, all these questions about social networking, and he didn't want to answer my questions. He's being very evasive. And I was starting to wonder why he agreed to be in this session. Finally, I got frustrated, and he is a friend, and I turned to him in the middle with 600 people in the audience, and I said, come on, you can admit it. If I got you alone late at night, filled you with alcohol, you can confess. Don't you wish the internet would just go away? And he said, no, we love the internet. It teaches us things we've never known. It puts us in touch with our customers. And then as we're walking off stage, he turned to me and he said, you have no idea how often I wish it would go away. It was so much easier. One second example of that, I said, I started my work in 2000. 2002, the dot-com meltdown came. I can't tell you the number of people who came up to me pretending to be sympathetic, but saying things like, well, what are you going to do now? Now that this internet thing's over, what are you going to do? They were so excited that this thing has come and was going and they could get back to selling television or advertising time or selling their newspaper the way it used to be. And of course, our work showed that the meltdown was only the end of business plans written on the back of napkins. So only in the silliness, and the internet as an important part of people's lives was only growing. So where social networking is concerned, I had dinner about 6 months ago with the CMO, the Chief Marketing Officer, of a global company, Kimberly-Clark. I don't think this story will offend anybody. I think it's sort of cute. And the CMO of Kimberly-Clark says to me over dinner, "You want to know what we do at Kimberly-Clark? If it leaks from the human body, we sell a product." They sell Kleenex, they sell toilet paper, they sell feminine hygiene products like tampons, they sell Huggies, the baby diapers, and Depend, the adult diapers. And his question was, do people really want to have a relationship with the company that sells their toilet paper? And the answer is yes. People really do want to have a relationship with the company they buy their toilet paper from. So we've been spending a lot of time looking at what is the friend of a brand or the friend of a politician, but I'll stay with brands for a minute, worth. And of course, it's hard to generalize because people feel one way about the company that makes their toilet paper and another way about Apple Computer and their products. But to the degree that we can generalize, and there are great differences among, we found that about 50% of the friends of a brand are there to get something, to get a discount, a coupon, access, special information. It doesn't mean that they don't like and maybe they even love the brand, but they wouldn't bother having a relationship with the brand if they couldn't get something. They're there for a tangible benefit. And then we find about 14 to 18% of the friends of a brand are there either for legacy or aspiration. Legacy, this may be a product you grew up with that's warm to your heart, that makes you feel good, that you love the logo, but you may never buy it. You may just like the brand with never having any active relationship. Aspiration, Ferrari has 9 million friends. They won't tell me the answer to this, so I'm only guessing, but let's guess of those 9 million friends, 0.1% of them will ever buy a Ferrari. As a matter of fact, I just read in the newspaper this morning that Ferrari feels like they're making too many cars. They made about 7,500 last year, and that's sort of destroying the specialness of the brand, so they're going to cut it down to under 7,000. So 0.1% of the friends of Ferrari will ever buy the brand. Now, if you want to sell them T-shirts or keychains, that's another issue. But those are people who aspire to the brand and probably will never get there. Then there are brands like Chanel. Chanel makes some products, fragrances, and lipstick that many women can afford, and then most of their other products, dresses and handbags that most women cannot afford, but are easier to aspire to in the course of a lifetime than Ferrari. And then about 18 to 20% of the friends of a brand really are the friends of a brand. They love the brand. They want to tell the brand when they get it right. More importantly, they want to tell them when they get it wrong. They want to share their insights. They want to know about new products that are coming out. And those are the people historically advertisers have loved, because those are the people that you want to reach, and then they talk to their friends. So we're seeing that there is some value, but to the question, can we move money out of traditional television, print, advertising, and instead get earned media through social networking? The answer still is largely no. One last trend, and one of my favorite trends, and I think I'll describe everybody in this auditorium, certainly me, is a new and very powerful trend. Nobody wants to give up the internet. There are things about the internet we don't like. Spyware, viruses, spam, none of that cause people to leave. I mentioned at the beginning that 2% drop off each year. That's not out of dissatisfaction. The 2% who leave are people who leave because they change jobs and lose access or graduate from school, whose PCs break and they haven't gotten around or can't afford to get a new one. And those people almost always come back very quickly. Nobody wants to give up the internet, but we're tired of it defining our lives. Even though for most of us it's wireless, we're tired of thinking of it like an umbilical cord or a ball and chain. we realized that sometimes we couldn't leave the office if we can't be connected. Sometimes we couldn't go on vacation if we can't be contacted, but that doesn't mean we have to be contacted every minute of the vacation. We're looking for balance. We're looking for balance in that we want to enjoy the benefits of all this technology without experiencing all the disadvantages. And we've given this a name. We call this enough already. E-NUFF. Enough already is getting the benefits without all the disadvantages because we are frustrated. For example, sometimes I don't go to sleep until I answer all of my email. Well, you know what happens if I answer all my email just before I go to sleep? While I'm sleeping, damn it, everybody answers me. And it's all sitting there when I wake up in the morning, and I'm like the rat on the little treadmill, and I can never get away from it. We found for 13 years now that if you talk to the people who use the internet at work, 75% say it has made them more productive in their jobs. 20% say it hasn't made any difference, and 5% say it has made them less productive. So 3/4 say it has made them more productive. And they make comments like, now I can do in 30 hours what it used to take 40 hours to do. But the problem is nobody's working 30 hours and calling it a week. We're taking on more work than we've ever taken on before. We're working on Saturday nights and Sunday mornings and Christmas Eve and New Year's Day. Sometimes I talk to employers who complain about the amount of personal time people spend online at work. And when I hear that, I tell them they should just be quiet. Because we find for every hour most employees spend at the office online doing personal things, they're spending 3 hours at home doing work related to their jobs. The employers are making out like bandits, which is why companies like Volkswagen in Germany now have had to ban employers from contacting their employees through smartphones after hours unless they're willing to pay overtime. And enough already is also device fatigue. I'm embarrassed to admit that over at my hotel, in my suitcase, there are 8 charger cables. But the best example of this I ever saw was over the Christmas holidays 5-6 months ago. My friend sent his 16-year-old daughter to London on a school tour. Since it was a school tour, they put 3 girls to a room, and they put them in older, less expensive hotels in London, if such things exist. Well, these 3 16-year-old girls get to their room and discover to their absolute horror there is 1 electrical outlet in the room. 3 16-year-old girls, 3 digital cameras, 2 iPads, 2 smartphones, 2 Bluetooth earpieces, 1 Kindle, and 3 hair dryers. Although in fairness, hair dryers don't have to be charged. So these girls devised a technique or devised a plan. They set their alarm clock for every 90 minutes through the course of the night. And after 90 minutes, they would get up and take 2 devices out and put 2 new ones in. But the problem is most devices don't fully charge in 90 minutes. My iPad takes about 6 to 7 hours. So as one girl's less than fully charged device was being removed, she'd scream, "Wait, stop, it's not done." It was like Lord of the Flies in there. If you know, I guess you do, if you know that book. This is a real problem. During Hurricane Sandy in New York, if you lived above 34th Street, it was just a storm. And the next day you woke up, the sun was shining, and life was good. But if you lived below 34th Street, you may have been without power for 4 or 5 days. And far more dramatic and difficult for those people than the food in their refrigerator spoiling was the fact they couldn't charge their devices, which is why the people above 34th Street would take power strips and put them on the sidewalk in front of the building so that people below 34th Street could come up and charge their devices. Mayor Cory Booker in Newark opened his home for people to come in and charge their devices. And if you think about it, that's really pretty amazing, because charging your device, as I said with the hotel room in London, is not a 5-minute affair. You have to let people in your home for a couple of hours. But this is what happens. This is our biggest problem now during a power outage. And it's sort of coming around. In the 90s, or 80s and 90s, there were silly people like Donald Trump and Michael Milken who used to brag about the fact that they only got 3 hours a night sleep. And they were claiming somehow that sleep was a waste of time, a time that could be better spent making money and doing things. Of course, that's not true at all. It's essential to get sleep, to be able to stay healthy and to keep your mind active. And maybe they did sleep more and just pretended they only got 3 hours a night sleep. But then in the last 10 years, there are people like Jeff Bezos, the CEO of Amazon, worth about $25 billion, who now says he gets 9 hours a night sleep. Now you can brag about how much sleep you get, because the message is clear. If you're powerful enough, if you're Rupert Murdoch, you can sleep as much as you want, and people will be waiting for you when you wake up in the morning, which is why back to teenagers and sleeping next to their mobile phones, in addition to using their mobile phone as their watch, the other reason they slept next to their mobile phones was an acronym many of you probably know, an acronym called FOMO, fear of missing out. Fear that something was happening in their social life and they weren't going to know about it. So the best way to minimize that was to have it be the last thing they do before they go to sleep, the first thing they do when they wake up in the morning, and if they wake up in the middle of the night, they'll go to it. So now, with this enough already, we're seeing, not my term, the New York Times coined this term, now in 2013, the term JOMO. And JOMO is the joy of missing out. The desire to disconnect. Now, first, you see a lot of families do this as an experiment, where they'll take a week with the rule that there's absolutely no devices. And incidentally, usually the parents have a harder time than the kids. And when they do that, they all go through the same stages. There's the tremendous stage of withdrawal, the first 3 days, where every moment you're reaching for it and you're thinking about it. Because we did a little experiment at lunch tables and restaurants, and we found if you ask somebody, can I see your phone? After 45 seconds, they start getting nervous. They sort of want it back, and they're just not comfortable with it in their hands. So we see the first couple of days there's a withdrawal. Then these families, almost to a one, report that after 3 or 4 days, they start talking more, they do more as a family. At the end of the week, if they go to the week, they all say it was a wonderful exercise and they learned a lot, and then immediately go back to their old ways. There's no learning whatsoever. There's no change in habits. But we're seeing some people now are looking at the joy of missing out. Some of that is saying to people, now I even get recorded messages, I answer my email only when I get around to it, don't expect a response in the next couple of minutes. So we're seeing really profound changes in how people deal with the technology. Those are some of the things we look at. Since I don't have a PowerPoint, if anyone's interested in our reports, all of which are free, or learning more about what we do, our website is just digitalcenter.org. Center spelled the American way, or as I like to say, the right way. I am delighted. I know we have a break. I'm delighted. I'll stick around, anyone who has questions. But it really is a thrill, and I mean that as sincerely as I can say it, to be back in Bergen and at the Nordic Media Festival, thank you very, very much.